The UAE has left OPEC, and overnight, global oil prices exploded. Brent crude, the global oil benchmark, pierced $112 per barrel. WTI crossed $105, everyone panicked. Oil traders worldwide scrambled. Energy analysts rushed to weigh in. And people who had never once cared about oil prices suddenly started asking, why did it spike like this? But before you think this is just some energy story with no connection to your daily life, let me be very clear. Oil prices go up, fuel prices go up. Fuel prices go up, logistics costs go up. Logistics costs go up. And the price of food at the warung next door goes up too. So this isn't distant news. This hits your wallet directly. The United Arab Emirates officially withdrew from OPEC effective 1 May 2026. This decision brings to an end nearly 60 years of the UAE being part of the most influential oil cartel in the world. 60 years. Concluded in a single announcement. And I have to admit, this caught me off guard. Rumors of the UAE leaving OPEC had been circulating for years. But when it actually happens, it still lands like a shock. Because the UAE is no ordinary member. They are OPEC's third largest oil producer after Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And what makes their departure far more dangerous than it appears on the surface, the UAE is one of the very few OPEC members with significant spare capacity. The ability to rapidly increase production when the world needs emergency supply. Without the UAE, OPEC loses one of its most critical weapons. Losing the UAE isn't simply losing one member. It's like your star player, who also happened to be your best substitute, and walking out the door at the same time. But why did the UAE make such a monumental decision? And more importantly, there is one reason behind all of this that almost nobody is talking about. Something that has been quietly simmering behind the scenes for years, and that is exactly what we are going to break down in this video. Before we break down why the UAE left, we first need to understand what exactly is OPEC and how much power does it actually hold. OPEC was founded in 1960, born from the Baghdad Conference, attended by 5 founding nations: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela. The objective was simple yet powerful: coordinate oil production so that prices could be collectively managed and kept profitable for producer nations. In plain terms, rather than undercutting each other and sending prices into freefall, they agreed to play together, set individual quotas, sell at agreed prices, and at the peak of its power, OPEC was more than just an organization. They were the rulers of the global economy. The most dramatic proof came in when OPEC nations decided to impose an oil embargo on America and Western countries that had backed Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The result? Global oil prices surged 300% and virtually every Western economy was plunged into recession. 300% from one decision, one organization. Imagine today if a single cartel could bring the economies of America, Europe, and Japan, at all of them, to their knees within months. That was the power of OPEC in its prime, but that power has been slowly eroding. At its peak, OPEC controlled nearly 50% of the global oil market. Today, following America's emergence as a major oil producer through shale oil and fracking technology, OPEC's market share has fallen to around 33% of the global market. Since 2016, OPEC expanded its alliance into OPEC+, bringing in 12 additional nations including Russia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan. The combined OPEC+ bloc controls around 41% of global oil supply. Still significant, but a far cry from the dominance of the 1970s. And the UAE has been part of this system since 1967, joining through Abu Dhabi even before the UAE formally came into existence as a federation in 1971. For nearly 60 years, they were part of the cartel that once brought the world to its knees. Fun fact, the UAE is the only OPEC member with spare capacity comparable to Saudi Arabia. So for years, when a global supply crisis hit, the world depended on these two nations to respond swiftly. Now there is only one. But with all of that history, why did the UAE ultimately choose to walk away? I'll admit it, when I first heard the UAE had left OPEC, my immediate reaction was, well, that makes sense. Because if you've been following the drama inside, OPEC over the past few years, this isn't a surprise. This is the culmination of frustration that has been building for years. But there is one reason that almost nobody dares to discuss openly, and it's the most important one of all. The UAE and Saudi Arabia, the two strongest allies in the Gulf, have actually been engaged in a quiet war for a long time, and OPEC has become one of the battlegrounds. Let's break down every reason. Reason 1. The quota that became unbearable. The UAE's current production capacity has reached 4.85 million barrels per day. They have invested 150 billion over 10 years to achieve this expansion. Yet under the OPEC Plus agreement, they are only permitted to produce around 3.4 million barrels per day. Imagine building the largest bakery in the city, buying the most advanced equipment, hiring hundreds of staff, only to be told you can only sell 70% of what you can produce, while your competitors are free to sell everything they make. Frustrating? Absolutely. Reason 2. $150 billion investment that needs to deliver returns. The UAE has committed to $150 billion in upstream oil investment through to 2030, targeting 5 million barrels per day by 2027, target they actually accelerated from the original 2030 timeline. An investment of that magnitude simply cannot deliver returns if production keeps being throttled by OPEC constraints. Reason 3. The silent war between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. This is the one that gets discussed the least, and in my view, it's the most significant of all. The roots of this fracture can be traced back to 2021, when OPEC Plus talks nearly collapsed because the UAE demanded a higher production baseline. A compromise was eventually reached, but it still fell far short of their actual capacity. And that wasn't the only fault line. The two countries have long been on opposite sides of various regional conflicts over Yemen, over Iran, over their respective approaches to America and Israel. The UAE was the first Arab nation to normalize relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords in 2020. Saudi Arabia has not, and when the Iran-America war erupted, the divergence between the two nations became even more visible. Reason 4. The energy transition is becoming undeniably real. The UAE understands that the world is moving towards renewable energy. Oil demand will peak at some point, so the logic is straightforward. If oil is going to become less relevant in the future, it's better to pump and sell as much as possible now, while prices are still high, rather than leave that oil sitting in the ground, constrained by OPEC quotas. So the bottom line, this isn't just about quotas. It's about ambition, investment, geopolitics, and a long-term vision that Abu Dhabi and Riyadh have simply not shared for a very long time. All right, the UAE has officially left. Now the question you actually need answered, what are the consequences? And most critically, what does this mean for us in Indonesia? Global impact first. OPEC is structurally weaker. This isn't opinion. It's a fact acknowledged by virtually every energy analyst. The UAE was one of only 2 OPEC members with significant spare capacity. With them gone, OPEC's ability to respond to global supply shocks has been drastically diminished overnight. Imagine a football team that has lost not just one player, but the only substitute capable of stepping in at any moment, under any circumstances. That is OPEC's situation right now. The long-term picture is even more concerning. If the UAE genuinely ramps production up to 5 million barrels per day and floods the open market without OPEC constraints, global supply could become severely oversaturated. 2 scenarios emerge, and neither is comfortable. Scenario 1, oil prices collapse. Good for consumers in the short term, but devastating for producers, and potentially triggering a brutal price war between producing nations. Scenario 2, OPEC Plus disintegrates entirely. If the cartel falls apart, there is no longer any mechanism capable of stabilizing global oil prices. Volatility becomes permanent. In the short term, however, the immediate market impact remains contained. Why? Because the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical oil export corridor, is still disrupted by the Iran conflict. The UAE has an alternative route through the Fujairah terminal, but its capacity is not yet sufficient to absorb all of their production ambitions. Now the impact on Indonesia, and this is what you need to understand clearly. Indonesia is a net energy importer. We import more than 80% of our energy needs from the Middle East, which means every time global oil prices shake, we feel it immediately. The domino effect is very real. Oil prices rise and logistics costs rise. Prices of everything rise. For food and beverage SMEs alone, plastic packaging components can represent 10–15% of production costs. Everything climbs, and if costs rise but public purchasing power doesn't keep pace, the end result is large-scale efficiency cuts, which means the threat of mass layoffs, a fact that genuinely leaves me shaking my head. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just an oil corridor, it's also a fertilizer corridor. Rising fertilizer prices directly push up global food prices, which then triggers domestic inflation. From a single disrupted strait, the ripple effects reach all the way to the price of rice at your local warung. The question dominating global energy analysts right now, if the UAE can leave, who's next? And is OPEC still relevant? Let me set the record straight first. This isn't the first time. OPEC has lost a member. Qatar left in 2019. Indonesia left and rejoined. Ecuador, Angola, and Gabon have all walked away at various points. And every time someone left, OPEC survived. Smaller, but still standing. But the UAE's departure is different from all of those. This isn't a minor member leaving because they couldn't keep up. This is the second most powerful member, with a capacity of 4.85 million barrels per day, actively choosing to go it alone because they believe they can. And that is what makes this dangerous. One analyst put it plainly: if the UAE can prove that leaving OPEC causes no real damage, other nations may follow. The most frequently cited candidates: Iraq and Nigeria, two countries that have consistently violated their quotas and have a strong interest in producing more freely. If Iraq and Nigeria follow, OPEC loses more than half its production. And at that point, its relevance as a cartel capable of controlling global oil prices could genuinely come to an end. Yet there are those who still believe OPEC will endure. The argument is straightforward. The ability to act collectively in managing the market, keeping prices from going too high or too low, still requires coordination. And Saudi Arabia, which has the greatest stake in price stability, will continue fighting to preserve OPEC for as long as it can. So in my view, this isn't really about whether OPEC collapses or not. It's about OPEC slowly but surely losing its relevance, like an aging giant, still standing, but increasingly struggling to control what surrounds it. What is clear is that we are now entering a new era of global energy, an era where no single entity can fully control the price of oil, an era where volatility isn't the exception, it's the new normal. And for Indonesia, still heavily dependent on energy imports, this is a loud and urgent call to get serious about energy security, not just about subsidized fuel prices held steady through the end of 2026, but about the long-term, renewable energy, diversification of energy sources, and reducing dependence on imported oil. The question now, do you think Indonesia is genuinely prepared to navigate this increasingly unpredictable energy era? Or are we still too comfortable with the status quo? Write in the comments. Share this video with people who need to know. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are still many big stories yet to be told. See you in the next one.